Death at Daisy's Folly, Chapter 16. In the late Victorian and early Edwardian periods, the servant class underwent a dramatic change. Many individuals began to perceive opportunities for betterment in other situations and resent their paltry wages and low status in the great houses. This resentment was expressed in some instances by a sullen sluggishness, in others by outright belligerence and more or less open rebellion. Such individuals could easily be influenced by the anarchist sentiment which abounded in the last decade of the century. Thomas Seymour, Social Precursors of the Great War. Half stunned by what had just occurred between them, Charles sent Kate off with the instructions to see what she could learn from the women guests and the upper servants and upstairs maids, a daunting task, for there were quite a number to interrogate. It was a delicate task too, requiring not only finesse in asking questions, but an ear for lying answers. He did not doubt that Kate was up to it, though. When she had gone, he set up his camera and took the necessary photographs. He then summoned the men who had been promised and oversaw the removal of Wallace's body to the game larder, a low building with a stone floor, a wooden sink, and a large table for cleaning and butchering game, and heavy plank shelves suitable for laying out a corpse. He left Wallace in the company of a number of naked grouse and pheasant dangling from hooks in the rafters, with a man to guard the door. Then, after making inquiries as to the whereabouts of Deaf John, he went off to the nearby forge where the man was set to work. With luck, it would take only a minute to question him and discover whether he could shed any light on the groom's death. But questioning Deaf John took longer than he expected. Encountering the smith on the path to the forge, he was directed to the old man's cottage. According to the smith, the farrier, who worked under his supervision, had come to the smithy with chills and a fever that morning and had been sent back to his bed. "Perhaps," Charles said, "I should ask you to go with me to see him. If the man is truly deaf, I may not be able to make my questions understood." "He'll have no trouble," the smith said, wiping his nose on his coarse sleeve. "People think John's a simple and don't give him credit. He is canny right enough and clever at reading lips. Anyway, I seen his girl Meg going that way too, a little bit gone, carrying a pail of supper for her father's lunch. She'll help you talk him." The cottage stood at the end of a dirt lane lined by several such cottages, all rented to estate workers. The dooryard was mostly packed dirt, with the frosted remains of a few summer flowers under the window. The thatched building had only one room downstairs, with two small casement windows set into the thick walls and a Dutch door, the top half of which stood now open. Looking in, Charles saw that the dim room was furnished with a table, several chairs, a narrow bed with a potato sack thrown down by the way of a hearth rock, and a paraffin lamp set on the table for light. But the room was clean swept and neat. There was a small fire in the grate and a potted geranium on the window sill, and the thin mattress was covered with a bright green coverlet which had been thrown back. A stooped old greybeard, whom Charles took to be Deaf John, his shoulders hunched under a blue knitted shawl, sat in a wooden chair before the fire, his large calloused hand holding a bowl from which he was drinking a thick soup. A slight pretty girl of 16 or 17 sat on a stool at his knee, a worried expression on her thin young face. She was wearing a maid's working dress of blue stuff, covered by a white apron, and her curly brown hair was tucked under a white cap. The evident tenderness of her concern for her father warmed Charles's heart, and he was hesitant to intrude. But he had come to question the old man, and question he must. He cleared his throat quietly, as to not startle the girl. Even so, she whirled around, her mouth falling open at the sight of a stranger in the doorway. "I'm sorry to have frightened you, Meg." He took off his hat. "My name is Charles Sheridan. I've come to—" The girl's brown eyes became very large, the eyes of a frightened doe, and the freckles showed against the sudden pallor of her cheeks. "You're the one what's doing the investigating?" she asked in a small, frightened voice that was barely more than a whisper. "What do you want with me? I don't know anything." He smiled to allay her fears. "My business is with your father," he said, opening the bottom half of the door and stepping in. The old man, grey hair straggling on either side of his weathered face, was watching him intently. "I understand that you can help me communicate with him." The girl looked at her father, trading fright for worry. But he don't know anything either, sir. He took a bad sick this morning and can't work. He's been right here, either lying in bed or sitting in front of the fire since I had breakfast. Why, he ain't even heard about Lord Wallace's getting shot." Charles was not surprised at the speed with which news travelled on the estate. He suspected that rumour of Wallace's murder had reached the lodge before the messenger left for Chelmsford. And in spite of the prince's concern for secrecy, the news had by now reached the far outskirts of the park and was on its way to Dunmow. "It's not about Lord Wallace's death that I wish to inquire," he said, and was startled by the sudden and involuntary relief that flooded the girl's face. Struck by the idea that she knew something, he was about to question her, but he caught himself. Kate, a woman and less intimidating, would be better able to persuade the girl to reveal anything she might know. "I've been told that your father saw someone coming out of the stable yesterday morning, about the time the prince's groom was killed. Will you ask him if that is so?" Deaf John put his hand on his daughter's arm and made a gruff sound and nodded vigorously. "He's saying he wants to tell you what he knows," she said nervously. "He read your lips, you see, sir, although sometimes it's better if I ask him, to make sure he's got it right." "Does he know the name of the person he saw coming out of the barn?" The girl put her lips close to her father's ear and shouted, "He wants to know who it was, Dad! Do you know his name?" The old man shook his head, and grasped the shawl, lifted it and settled again on his shoulders, saying something that sounded to Charles like a harsh, confused garble. "'Twere a person in a cloak, he says," the girl interpreted. She seemed to Charles to be less apprehensive about this subject. "A man or a woman?" Another shout and another garble. The old man pointed at Charles's boot. "'Twere a man, by his boots," she said. The old man said something, amplified by signs and gestures. "Black boots," the girl went on, watching her father. "Dad don't know his name, but he owns a big grey mare." There was another consultation, and she added, "A big grey mare with a new shoe on her left hind foot." "Thank you," Charles said, inwardly exultant. With such a clear description, it should be fairly easy enough to discover the clothesman's name. He was thanking her for her help when a shadow blotted the light from the door. "Who's there?" a man's voice inquired with rough concern. "'Tain't the doctor, is it? You ain't took that bad, I hope." "Marsh!" Meg exclaimed and jumped to her feet, her eyes going from Charles to the other man with a return of the fear that Charles had seen earlier. No, 'tain't the doctor," she said hurriedly. "Dad's heat up all his soup and's ready for a nap. He'll be back to work tomorrow for sure, so don't need to stay." Marsh, a surly, pock-faced young man wearing the green and gold livery of a footman, looked a little surprised at her sudden dismissal. He dropped an armload of wood beside the fire and brushed the bark off his sleeve. "The smith wants him back tomorrow. I don't think so." He raised his voice and bent over the old man. "You wants to stay in bed another day or twa, old John," he shouted. "I can do without you at the forge." He lowered his voice and added to the girl, "Little as they pay, they'll scarcely miss him." He turned to face Charles, his eyes angrily slitted. "And who be ye?" "It's all right, Marsh," the girl said. With an obvious effort at intervention, she stepped between them. "It's only somebody her ladyship sent to—" "You're the one who's doing the job for the police, ain't you?" Marsh asked belligerently. He pulled his black brows together and thrust out his jaw. "Well, you might as well get yourself gone, then. His home's private. There's nothing to be learned here." Meg touched the young man's sleeve. "It's all right, Marsh," she had repeated. "The gentleman's done his asking and is leaving." When Marsh did not respond, he leaned closer and added so low that Charles had to strain to hear it. "He was only asking about the stable boy." "I don't like it, Meg," Marsh muttered. The glance he cast at Charles was half fight, half fear. "I don't like his being here, snooping in poor folks' business." The young man was something less than 21, Charles thought. It was unusual for a footman, Meg's brother, was he, or her sweetheart, to be so bellicose. At Somersworth, in the lifetime of his father, such an attitude would have been grounds for an instant dismissal with bad character. But times were changing, and with them the demeanour of the servants. Their submissive obedience was giving way to a natural, irrepressible wish to better themselves, and, when that wish was thwarted, a sullen resentment. That, he suspected, was what lay behind the young man's antagonism. If Marsh were in his employ, some more challenging and interesting work would have to be found for him, with opportunities for advancement. He bowed to the old man, nodded at Meg and Marsh, and went to the door. "Thank you for your help," he said. "You're welcome," Meg said with an attempt at civility. Marsh growled something unintelligible, and they both turned back toward the fire and the old man. Charles retraced his step to the smithy, a three-sided stone building with a tiled roof as dark as a cave. The roof and walls were black with the soot of many coal fires that had been built in the enormous stone forge in the back, and the place rang with the infernal clanging of the smith's heavy hammer. The air was acrid with coal smoke and the smell of the hot oil that was used for tempering. Walking into the place was like walking into the devil's den. On one side of the forge, Charles saw a sturdy boy of hardly more than 12 pumping a large ox-hide bellows fixed flat to the dirt floor. The bellows directed a stream of air into the furnace, fanning the hungry flames. On the other side of the forge, the smith was bent over an anvil, punching holes in a hot ox shoe he was fashioning from an iron bar. Behind him stood the huge beast, docile in the elaborate leather and canvas sling that supported his weight, while the smithy shot him, one hoof at a time. The smith, a burly man in a leather apron, his face blackened with coal smudge, looked up as Charles approached. "Get what you was after?" he asked with a certain familiarity. Charles had long ago noticed the easy address of craftsmen, whose skill and experience seemed to give them the right to speak as an equal to almost anyone. With the skill of long patience, the smith picked up the hot shoe with his forged tongs, turned swiftly to hoist the ox's right foreleg, and applied the shoe against the horny wall of the hoof. There was a great sizzle and smoke, but the animal stood compliant as before, appearing not to even notice. "I made a start," Charles said. He waited until the smith had finished putting in the nails, then nipped them off and clinched them over and dropped the beast's leg. "I wonder," he said, "do you know the name of the man whose large grey mare has a new left hind shoe? I would like to interview him." The smith seemed to find this funny. Chuckling broadly, he took another piece of metal and placing it on the forge, waiting for it to glow red. Motioning to the boy to increase the rhythm of the hissing, wheezing bellows, he said, "You would, eh? Well, sir, I doubt you'll be interviewing him any time soon." Charles raised his voice. "And why is that?" he asked, over the roar of the forge. "'Cause he's dead, that's why. He's the gentleman who was found shot this morning." The smith picked up his hammer and began to pound the glowing metal. "Lay to it, boy," he shouted over the ringing of iron on iron. "Lay to it fine, me lad." Outside the forge and down the path it was so quiet that Charles could hear the dry leaves rustling. So Reginald Wallace had been in the stable around the time of the boy's death. Did this fact suggest that Wallace himself was the killer, or his murder an act of revenge by one of the servants? Or was he a witness murdered to keep him from revealing what he knew? He was some distance away from the forge before he suddenly remembered something he should have dealt with prior to any interviews. He took out the folded paper Kate had given him, with which she had pulled from Wallace's pocket as he lay on the ground. He opened it and scanned the page quickly. When he finished reading it, he had a firm grasp of the direction in which the investigation must proceed. But it was a revelation that brought him no joy.